take some of this specialized equipment, cranes and tractors that will be brought in here. Otherwise, I think there's the risk that some of those who are trapped and the rescuers themselves could be harmed.
Okay, and we might tell the audience that around the World Trade Center, one building has already collapsed and some structures have been weakened. So authorities do not know how strong those structures are, whether they will collapse, and obviously they have to be very deliberate. Now, David, I heard you earlier today. You were almost hurt as well as Tom Hinton was in the early going. You just got out of there barely, correct?
Well, I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but there was about 10 seconds there where I actually questioned whether or not I was going to make it. I was outside the World Trade Center a few blocks away. I don't recall which street. I was arguing with a police officer because I wanted to go closer. He told me, no, it was not safe. I was arguing about presenting my press credentials. Suddenly we heard this enormous sound that we've heard some of your other guests talk about. We looked up, and the building was literally starting to collapse. Someone shouted, run, and we didn't need anyone to tell us to run. We just started to move as fast as we could in the opposite direction, and we saw behind us, over our shoulder, I saw this enormous white cloud of debris and smoke falling around us, and I seemed to stay just a few feet in front of it, and at that point, that's when I made it to a payphone, because there is no communication down here. Most of the cell phones, at least earlier today, were out, and I was able to describe on the air exactly what had happened. But
I wanted to tell you, you're not an alarmist.
Some frightening moments there.
Right. You're not an alarmist, and I just want to tell everybody that Dan Cohen and Tom Hinton and David Lee Miller, I mean, these people are putting their lives at risk going down and covering this story. Now, the other thing is that, and this breaks my heart, there are 200 police and 250 firefighters missing right now, according to city authorities. How are the other police and firefighters reacting to that many of their brothers possibly being dead?
Today we saw both police and firemen literally in tears. We tried to talk to some of the firemen here. One of the battalions just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. They did not want to go on camera. And you have to remember, Bill, that some of these guys were here in 1993 during the World Trade Center bombing. So they remember that first experience, and combined with this experience, it's just doubly horrific. Some of those who died, we are told, were actually, they made it to the 34th floor of the first tower. They were trying to rescue some of those who were trapped inside. Some of them got out. They realized the building was going to collapse. They ran outside, and we're told that they got to an overpass near the West Side Highway here, which runs near the World Trade Center. And they were under this overpass, and that's what saved them. But some of the other firemen did not get out, and they are trapped under the rubble this evening. Bill?
All right, David. Thank you very much for that report. It's just a harrowing situation. It's important for all Americans to know the emotion of this story, and that something has to be done here. Something has to be done. Now, there were many, many civilians who were have their lives altered forever. We have a package of reaction from people who barely got out with their lives today. Let's roll that.
Well, when we got down to the bottom floor, we thought we were okay, and then there was a collapse. We don't know what collapsed. There was a collapse of something. The police and fire department told us to go run to the wall and don't look outside. Next thing we know, billowing black smoke just came in, and I mean, it went down my mouth, up my nose, all over the place, and people were hysterical at that time.
Keep going, keep going. You're okay.
There was a big shaking. Some of the ceilings collapsed. Looks like there was a fire in the elevator shafts. What did you feel?
The whole floor shook. The building was shaking, and you know, it felt like a bomb hit or a plane hit or something like that. But the whole floor was shaking.
A plane did hit.
A plane did hit. Yeah, and then we looked out the window. All we saw was debris all over the place. But we thought the building was going to topple over. It was going so.
Well, one of them did.
One of them did. We were in town one. We made it out.
We do need to put it down now. I think we need to put it down now. Here we go.
The one just got out of the tunnel in the blue.
The subway tunnel?
Yeah.
The subway.
Yeah.
I saw the building.
from the building, from the 100th floor, and I saw the building just coming down. What are you doing?
We just felt a big explosion. I didn't know what you know, after the fact that we talked about, knew it was a plane. I was on the way down. It was pretty calm. There's some small fires, and from 85 on below, there were small fires and some floods, but it wasn't that bad. And I had just gotten out of the building. I was crossing the street when I heard some rumbling. I saw someone coming off the top of the building. I just ran.
There was nowhere to run. People were just falling down on top of each other. People were, you know, panicking. They were scared. You know, here's a 100-foot, you know, here's a 100-story building just collapsing, coming down. Where do you run? You couldn't help nobody. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. If you didn't have an oxygen tank, you couldn't even go in there. You couldn't because of the debris. Concrete would just choke you. All this white that you see in the street is concrete. It's concrete. This is all concrete that you're looking at. Everybody's pretty much depressed, but until we actually get numbers and find out what the actual story is, you know, we only hope and pray for the best.
All right, go down here and change it.
My heart broke. My heart bleeds for everybody in there. Civilians, firefighters, police.
You were supposed to be on the 22nd floor?
That's right.
Yeah, but I don't have a cell phone.
What? You were on your way into work?
And I was late. I guess it wasn't my number.
All right, what are you going to be doing for the next hour?
It wasn't my number.
President Bush is set to address the nation in about 7 minutes. Of course, we will bring you his remarks live. But right now, the investigation of who did this terrible deed is going on in Washington, in New York, in Boston, in Newark, New Jersey, and across the world. Joining us from Washington is James Bamford. He is an investigative reporter who writes about national security issues and intelligence gathering.
Shocked. By then, the whole building sort of implodes. It just goes like this. And you see like a side of the building, and then it goes, and there's this ball, this silver yellow ball sort of heading towards you, kind of in slow motion. You can't figure out what to do. People are starting to run like crazy.
If you take a look behind
Then at 10 a.m., news of another passenger plane in trouble. Someone on United Airlines Flight 93, traveling from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, called 911 and reported a hijacking. Then an explosion and silence. The plane crashed here, some 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board. So far, 3 passenger jets used kamikaze style, and a 4th that might have been. 266 people on board killed. The death toll on the ground still unclear. Then, at 10:30, another sickening sight. The tower still standing, following its twin, collapsing, vanishing in a cloud of smoke. By 11 o'clock, the sense of alarm had spread across the country. Troops standing guard as national landmarks were shut down. Fighter jets actually patrolling the skies as the last airborne passenger planes rushed to safety. 11:14, officials trying to manage the disaster, struggling to describe it all.
First of all, Chief, do we have any idea of how many people are in there?
We have no idea. Now, as you know, it was pretty much rush hour time that this took place this morning, so the numbers we don't know yet. We tried to get almost everybody out that we could early on.
10,000 people in each tower would typically be in there on a normal business day, and we get about another 5,000 visitors during the course of the entire day. So by 8:30, 9 o'clock, the building should have been full.
And New Yorkers were struggling too.
And now they both collapsed. There's no more World Trade Centers.
At 11:42, another plane from Boston declared an emergency. Fearing a bomb on board, it landed in Cleveland. Soon, all planes in Canada as well as the U.S. were grounded. The borders with Mexico and Canada were sealed, and Major League Baseball announced the cancellation of all games scheduled for today. At 1:12, President Bush, at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, again spoke to the nation.
freedom itself was attacked.
The investigation at the Al-Khobar Towers, which was conducted by retired General Wayne Downing, who's with us in our Washington Bureau. We'll talk to him after the president tonight. All of these investigations have gone on and on and on and on, and many of them just really didn't resolve anything in the final analysis.
Yet many of them did. The largest acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, ironically the bombing of the World Trade Center, the attacks in East Africa have been solved to the extent that people have been charged. Many have been brought back to this country. The FBI actually has a terrific track record that way in chasing these leads out to the ends of the earth. We were talking about something a minute ago, though, that is part of the fog of war in these things. After the Al-Khobar explosion, there were intercepts of people calling Osama bin Laden's headquarters to congratulate him. And in these intercepts, there was no, he didn't say, well, thanks, but it wasn't me. Now the government has taken the position that it was the Iranians. So you really have to sort through the information very carefully before you choose your suspects.
Yeah, I just simply wish to make the point that it's going to take a long time, and that the impatience that we all feel about striking back at somebody who's done this thing to the country is not going to be requited, I think, for very long. ABC's Pierre Thomas, by the way, reports that his FBI sources are telling him that several people on board two of the planes which went down, this would be the one at the Pentagon, at least one of those coming either to New York or to Pennsylvania, were able to get out on their cell phones and call their relatives. And they described horrific scenes on board the aircraft, people being attacked and stabbed on board the aircraft itself. We've heard at least one piece of information that the weapon of choice, at least on one of the aircraft, was a box cutter that professionals and sometimes amateur use with the razor blade through it that enables it to open up cardboard boxes in a hurry, and has, of course, been a weapon of crime with which we're all familiar. And as John Miller, who knows more about these things than most, pointed out easier, you take a plastic one on board and it's very hard for a security device to detect. But I want to go quickly to Midtown New York City again, just before we go to the president, and get a quick update from Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Peter, I'm standing out here, and as you can see around me, there's a dramatic change in activity, and I don't know how much you could hear earlier when we were telling you about it, but we have 6 bulldozers down here now. We have an entire line, an entire street full of EMS crews and ambulances. It appears they have got the lights up, the generators are working, and it's very possible they could be moving in soon for some kind of activity actually on the site. And I've got Don Daler here with me. We've been dividing up all the duties here, and he's been down to the scene. And also, J.D. Halpern, who said he's just a volunteer who came in from California and was around the area. I just wanted to know, how much fire is there? You said you were just at ground zero. How much fire is left?
Well, the building 7, there was no fire there whatsoever, but there was one truck putting water on the building, but it's collapsed completely. And then the other building that there were some flames still coming up was in World Trade Center 1, but not a lot.
And you said you saw melted tour buses, melted cars?
The cars that were right down there, it was just unbelievable. They were twisted and melted into nothing. The debris is just unbelievable. And then you can see fire trucks and police vehicles that were down there early that all their windows, the windshields are completely blown out must have been from when debris dropped.
We can even see from here that the smoke seems to have gone down, Don. And I want to repeat, Peter, because J.D. was saying, as well as Don earlier, in case you didn't hear us, that it is carpeted up there. It is ankle deep in papers.
In some places, papers and debris go up 2 or 3 feet high. You have to wade through in some areas.
These are financial documents.
Yeah, the ones I looked at, many of them were financial documents, very personal documents that when I saw the first explosion that hit, there was just a snow cascade of paper, and the whole area down there is just coated with it.
Well, Peter, again, we'll let you know as soon as we can confirm that they are going in to the site. We should say that the mayor was here just a minute ago and drove by, waved at us, but would not stop. Back to you.
Diane, just exactly where are you?
We're about 4.5 blocks from ground zero.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane Sawyer. Don Daler did a wonderful job for us earlier today, giving me people that have.
Well, what we're going to be doing, we've been on the phone all day, getting individuals who want to donate blood, making sure that they had their donor's card, so that we're not wasting time. There is tomorrow at 12 noon at Reverend Floyd Flake, former congressman, my predecessor, we will be having a prayer vigil and information time at Allen AME.
What is the address there? Where is it going to be?
Allen AME is on Merrick Boulevard and
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush, in his second address to the nation, and certainly the most grave speech that he has made in his very young presidency, as he talked tonight about the terrorists attempting to shatter steel in buildings but not being successful in shattering the steel of resolve in this country, saying the bright light of freedom will continue to burn. He was a sorrowful and sober president, but also one filled with resolve, as he said, we will find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice. This has been a long and difficult day for the president, and it's just the beginning because there are many complex decisions that remain ahead of him now. NBC's Tim Russert joins me now from the Washington Bureau, where he is our Washington Bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. Tim, the president tomorrow will obviously be sending out a lot of directives to his military, to his law enforcement officers, and also to the people who are responsible for this nation's security at airports and in other places.
Who have been sheltering Osama bin Laden, and against any others that America thinks might be bankrolling him. You may remember after the last attacks on the embassy, there was America, Bill Clinton at the time, sent in attacks against Sudan and Afghanistan. That clearly didn't destroy the Osama bin Laden network, and somehow George Bush is going to have to come up with something more persuasive, more devastating than simple missiles. But as you say, I think that was a warning to everyone around the world that America is now determined to go out and hunt down those that carried out these attacks.
A lot of Americans would be hoping for words of comfort, words of support, words of resolve and encouragement, something to get them through this disaster. Do you think they heard the right words from their president?
I think actually it was a very good speech, yes. I think that there was the right balance, I would say, of comfort and firmness. They clearly wanted to know that, as he said, that terrorists may be able to destroy the foundations of a building, but they cannot destroy the foundations of American society, that steel may burn, but the American will not. I think those are probably very comforting words to many, many Americans around this country tonight who are in a deep state of shock about what has happened. This, after all, is not a country that, with the possible exception of Pearl Harbor, but the mainland of America has never been invaded in any sense. And so there is a certain sense of tremendous security here, which maybe perhaps Europeans and other countries do not share. And that has certainly been shattered tonight. I think when he talked about the fact that America is the brightest beacon of freedom, clearly that is something that many Americans will sympathize with. But what they will really be listening for and what they will have been gladdened about was the words such as the American economy will be open for business tomorrow, the federal government will go back to work, and American way of life will continue.
He said also, Tom, as you mentioned, that the search is already underway for those responsible. On the other hand, the FBI in Washington, presumably its headquarters, were among the buildings which were evacuated today.
That's right. Every single federal building in this town was evacuated, including the FBI, including obviously the Pentagon, where there was one of these plane crashes, including Congress. And so really for most of today, this has been a town pretty much without a government. George Bush only came back here in the last hour or so. Having said that, though, clearly the government does continue.
The explosion blew and it knocked everybody over. Less than an hour later, the South Tower came crumbling down.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
But it was far from over.
Tower 2 collapsed into Tower 1. Within minutes after that, we were ordered out.
When the dust settled, signs of life started to emerge.
Chaos. It's just chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy. I can't believe this shit is happening. I really can't. It's nightmares. Armageddon right here.
This was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, but not the first attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, terrorists set off bombs in the basement in an effort to take down the two towers. They failed. Today, mission accomplished. I tell you what, it's a sad day for America. It really is.
By 2 o'clock this afternoon, firefighters and police officers and paramedics by the hundreds stood by, many of them feeling helpless. There was nothing they could do at this point because the building was still unsecured.
Our main priority is to get in, do a search and rescue, look for survivors, and then clean up what's left. And we can't do that until the building is deemed safe.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always. A sign on a paramedic's van spoke volumes.
We know we have some of the major brass of our department missing. We're trying to find them, too.
New York Port Authority Police Chief William Hall choked back tears. For him, this was no longer just work.
On a personal level, because I know that these are all your men and it's a business, but I'm sure that a lot of these guys are your friends. How you helping
Not a
them?
business now, it's personal now.
Sir?
It's personal now. We have to get them.
Back live, we have had little relief here. Take a look at this. Hours ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. A 42-story building that crumbled hours after the initial devastation. It was the one calamity here that was not a surprise. Police had evacuated the area earlier, fearful building number 7 would indeed fall down. Minutes after the second tower collapsed, we met a firefighter named Tim McGee, a New York City firefighter. He was covered in soot from the top of his helmet to the bottom of his feet. He was crying. He told me that he had lost all of his men when the building collapsed. He asked us to reach his wife, Maria, tell her that he was okay, that he had survived. Quote, tell her, I love her. Dan.
Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. Mind you that the World Trade Center complex has 7 buildings. So the Twin Towers went down, they're the big ones, but then the 47-story World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. That was near the end of Byron Pitts' report. Now, building 5 in the World Trade Center complex was for many hours today described as on the brink of collapse. The state of that building at this hour is uncertain. It was long ago evacuated completely. Now about today's other terrorist strike at the seat and symbol of U.S. military might, the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, first opened in 1943, never before directly attacked. There were 64 people aboard American Flight 77, the jetliner hijackers used to ram into the Pentagon. CBS's David Martin reports the deadly impact there. David?
Dan, fires are still burning, but Pentagon officials say the flames are under control and the Pentagon will be open for business tomorrow. But Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had a grim warning that casualties will be high.
Some people have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Clip, this ball over here hit another ball and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, oh my God.
A hijacked American Airlines jet, which had just taken off from Dulles Airport, flew right up the main highway leading north into Washington and straight into the citadel of American military power.
There was no doubt about it. It was American Airlines slammed right into the building, and there was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
Fearful that, like the World Trade Center, a second airliner was on its way, most of the building's 23,000 workers fled.
Plane's coming in. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. We're not playing around here. Let's go.
F-16 fighters circled overhead looking for a second attack, but the damage had already been done. The plane had drilled a hole about a third of the way through the world's largest office building. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals as the fire spread and an entire section of the building collapsed, trapping many, many more inside.
Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense.
One ray of hope. The Pentagon is undergoing a major renovation, and some of the offices in the path of the plane were vacant.
We're trying to find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
When the plane hit, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld moved from his office on the other side of the building into the National Military Command Center in the basement. With smoke hanging in the air, he ordered aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers to New York and Washington, where they can serve as floating hospitals, help with the cleanup, and provide air defense against the possibility of more attacks. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a clear threat of military retaliation.
I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Right now, suspicion focuses on Osama bin Laden, and we have some new pictures of this damage done to the Pentagon by whoever these terrorists were. First, really close-up pictures of the damage. I'm looking at it for the first time with you. I do not see any evidence there of the fuselage of the plane. Those are corridors I've walked down thousands of times, and right now they're unrecognizable. Back to you, Dan.
David Martin reporting live again from the Pentagon. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has confirmed that some of the first police officers and firefighters on the scene were killed. And the mayor added that in general, quote, the number of casualties will be more than most of us can bear. Mike Carter, vice president of the Firefighters Union here in New York City, estimates that half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene may, I underline that word, may be dead. I quote Mike Carter of the Firefighters Union. We have entire companies that are just missing. We lost chiefs. We're going to have to bury a lot of people, Carter said. Roman Catholic Church Cardinal Edward Egan, who administered last rites to dozens of victims, said that the firefighters and police were, quote, dead in great numbers, quote unquote, the Cardinal. Police Department and union sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that 78 police officers were missing. However, Assistant Chief Tom Fahey said the number of known missing among police officers is not that high. The emergency medical service worker, Luis Garcia, said initial reports indicated that bodies were buried beneath the 2 feet at least, of soot on streets around the Trade Center. And Garcia said a lot of vehicles are running over bodies because bodies are all over the place. Garcia is a 15-year veteran who had 2 people die in his ambulance on the way to the hospital. That gives you some of the mood, the atmosphere, and some of the facts and eyewitness reports that surround us here in New York City tonight. Now, to punish those behind today's attacks, the U.S. must first and foremost determine who there are. There's been much speculation about that today, but so far, it's all speculation. The facts are few. Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi Arabian millionaire who was last reported in Afghanistan, he's widely believed to be in Afghanistan, is the most frequently mentioned suspect. But as we have before, for fairness and accuracy, it's dictated that we say nobody knows who committed these crimes today. But CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington is closely following the investigation.
It's a difficult subject because we as Americans are very uneasy sometimes with the type of people we have to deal with to get this kind of intelligence. So on the one hand, we want the information, but on the other hand, we get very upset sometimes with some of the dirty, rotten people you must deal with who have this kind of information. And I think we're in a new era now. I mean, I think we've seen a formal declaration of war on the United States, although it shouldn't surprise us. We've got a lot of people saying this, our enemies, people who hate us, for many years. But now we see a manifestation on a scale that is almost unbelievable.
Downing, I very much appreciate you waiting for us and taking the time to tell us, to talk to us. Is the former Commander-in-Chief of the Special Operations Unit, is General Downing, and he wrote the Kobar's report, the report which investigated the attack on Americans in Saudi Arabia in November of 1995.
Are now first starting to work that scene. They're starting to have some very interesting results. 2 Port Authority police officers, the Port Authority being the entity that runs the World Trade Center, have been found trapped in the rubble. There is a team of police officers trying to dig them out. They're apparently alive. A strange case, a 911 operator in Pennsylvania says she's received a call from people trapped in the rubble 40 feet from the Vista Hotel or the Millennium Hotel. They say they're near a fountain.
On the west side of Manhattan.
Yes.
Right.
in the World Trade Center complex, and they're calling out from where they're trapped beneath the rubble to a 911, perhaps on a Pennsylvania cell phone, but it went to an operator in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to kind of triangulate where they are to get to them. So things are picking up there. They've also brought in dogs from all the counties around the city to aid in helping to sniff victims out.
Exactly as we've said before today, exactly they do in the case of an earthquake. People are now underground, and dogs are just the best thing you have in trying to locate them.
Yet, as we've learned so often in modern times, in recent times, in Columbine, the role of the cell phone in modern disaster is incredible. From the people who called out from the airplane, something we really didn't expect, an odd development, to people perhaps calling out from the rubble, if that's a legitimate call to the Pennsylvania operator.
Great. John Miller, will come back to you. Now to try to examine the building. ABC's Robert Krulwich has put together a piece on the structural engineering of the World Trade Centers, perhaps better able help us to understand that when these two aircraft hit these two towers today, exactly what was going on. Robert?
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength, and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Well, that report, as we look at New York City at night, which has a still quality about it tonight, the city of light at night, as so many American cities are, but there's a still, almost calm look of it from the sky. It's anything but that on the ground. But this is the second time from Robert Krulwich and also from some architect engineers we talked to a little earlier that say it was the heat which caused the building to collapse, because the steel at the top of the building would maybe have only been able to sustain an hour and a half of intense fire, and then the steel begins, as Robert points out, so clearly collapse upon itself all the way down to the bottom. I think we have with us on the phone or in person from Seattle, John Magnuson, who is an engineer. John, are you there? John Magnuson, who is with the company that actually built the World Trade Center towers. John, have you heard our two layman explanations tonight of what it was we think collapsed the building, and do you agree or disagree?
I agree. I need to say one thing. At the time of the design of the World Trade Center, that was in the mid-1960s, and I was in 6th grade, so to kind of put in perspective how much time has passed since this design was actually completed. But the description of the fact that steel, when it gets up...
Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this.
And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights, 1 from a flight attendant and 2 from passengers that were on board the flights. And they all talk about knives. There's, again, no mention of guns. In the first case, it was that flight that came out of Boston, and that was an American Airlines flight, and it was a flight attendant who apparently got a cell phone call off. I've heard variously it was to American Airlines operations or maybe somewhere else, but she reported that her fellow attendants had been stabbed in the back of the plane, and that the cabin had been taken over, and up front that the crew of the plane had been taken over, and that the plane was going down in New York, was the quote that we heard. Then, on the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, that was 17 minutes behind that first flight, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. In the first call, he told his father that a flight attendant had been stabbed and the plane had been hijacked. Then the phone went dead. Then he got another call off to his father and said the plane was going down. So that, again, is a plane that went into the second Twin Tower of the World Trade Center. On the third flight of the day to be hijacked, the one that left from Dulles Airport, was supposed to go to San Francisco, instead was taken over, looped around, brought back to the Pentagon. It was Barbara Olson, the CNN commentator and Washington lawyer, and the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who called her husband Theodore twice from the plane before it went down. I'm sorry, I think she called once, but she talked about knife-like instruments being used by the hijackers in the back of the plane, and said that passengers had been forced to the back of the plane. Anyhow, all this talk about knives might suggest that something managed to get through X-rays, and maybe it was thought by the terrorists that it would be easier to get knives through the X-ray machines and not be caught at it than to get guns through. At any rate, we may hear differently later, but so far there's been no mention of guns. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Robert Hager tonight with a complete wrap-up of the aviation component of all this. No one could have anticipated that hijacked planes would be used, in effect, as guided missiles, although Tom Clancy, in one of his very popular books, did have a hijacked plane crashed into the U.S. Capitol. There have been other attempts in the past by other terrorists. You'll remember that there was an attempt to take some planes out of the Philippines and blow them up over the Pacific after the capture of the terrorists who were responsible for the original bombing of the World Trade Center. And there have been other planes as well. An Air India flight was blown up in midair, to say nothing of Pan Am 103, which was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland, by terrorists widely believed that they were from Libya. And they have gone on trial, obviously, and that killed a great many Americans on that flight as well. So it's not the first time that this has happened, but it's never been used in quite this fashion before. And if you have been impatient with airline and airplane security in the past, wait until there's a resumption of flights. There's going to be a great change in this country. If you fly in the Middle East or through many parts of Europe, you're often several times questioned before you can get on the flight, as well as all the electronic security that you have to go through. You have to get to the airport well in advance.
The 80th floor, my estimation is that the south building, which is what you're looking at now, that was struck at approximately between the 50th and 60th floors.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere.
A few minutes later, the president's chief of staff, Andrew Card, told Mr. Bush about the New York City events during an appearance at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida. President Bush then gave this statement.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Ten minutes after the president spoke, a third airliner smashed into the southwest side of the Pentagon building, a mile from downtown Washington, causing a huge fireball followed by heavy smoke. People were carried out, others lay on the ground.
It came in at such a deep angle at such fast speed. It was, the severity of, like I was telling the gentleman, it was a real severe intention is what it had to it. You could tell it was like a suicide bomber. But I'm not saying it was a bomb, but, it was a plane. And it just came, it came streaking down and it hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up, like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
Within minutes of the attacks, officials in Washington began evacuating the U.S. Capitol building. Later in the morning, armed security personnel were seen on the roof of the White House, which was evacuated. Later, all other federal buildings in the Capitol were closed down. The Federal Aviation Administration grounded all flights nationwide. Meanwhile, there were reports of a 4th jetliner crash outside Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania. "10:06 a.m. back in New York City, the second World Trade Center tower to be struck collapsed.
Back! Move it! Come on!
10:28 a.m. Much of the top floors of the other tower also fell to the streets below.
Some water.
This was the view across the upper New York Bay past the Statue of Liberty at about 10:30 in the morning. This afternoon, just before 5:30, a 47-story building in the Trade Center complex collapsed.
And tonight, shortly after
5, also from Boston to Los Angeles. It also was in the air, taken over by hijackers. That plane made a turn towards New Jersey, then made virtually a U-turn and came up toward the Trade Tower from the south, came over Staten Island. It slammed into the second Trade Tower. It had also been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, before any of these planes actually hit the World Trade Center, a third plane, a United Airlines 757, American Airlines American Airlines 757, it was Flight 77 from Dulles, had taken off. It was bound for Los Angeles as well. We don't know much about the flight path of that plane. We believe it was in the air about 1 hour before it hit the Pentagon. Then we have the fourth plane. United Flight 93, another 757 en route from Newark to San Francisco. We are unclear about the departure time. We have some conflicting information about that, whether it was close to 8 o'clock or closer to 8:45. It did depart Newark Airport. It appears that hijackers may have taken control of the plane over Cleveland. That is when it suddenly made a turn back toward the east. We also understand that sometime at that point, someone from the cockpit called the FAA and requested a change in flight plan. They said, we're not going to San Francisco. We want to go to Washington, D.C., to DCA, which is National Airport. It's unclear whether there was another Washington target, perhaps, that this plane was aiming for. Either way, it didn't make it all the way to Washington. It crashed in Pennsylvania. A total of 266 passengers and crew on all 4 of these planes. The toll could have been even much, much worse on the jetliners because they were very lightly filled. They can hold anywhere from 185 to 250 people. The most crowded plane had 90 passengers and crew members on it. Peter, we also want to mention, if we can, that as this was unfolding, people on board these planes were able to communicate what was going on. We know some details about that. We know on Flight 11, that was the American Airlines flight, the first one that hit the World Trade Tower, a flight attendant was able to call the American Airlines Operations Center. The flight attendant informed them that a number of flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had stormed the cockpit. She was also able to tell them, apparently, the seat number of at least one of the hijackers. She was able to give them that information. We also know that there were some cell phone calls from at least 2 of the other planes. There was a cell phone call, as you have reported earlier, from the plane that slammed into the Pentagon, a woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane. And we understand there was also a cell phone call on the United 175 flight. That was the other flight that hit the World Trade Tower. Apparently, a son on that plane called his father from his cell phone and also said there were hijackers on board with knives. So we do know that as the events were unfolding, what was going on 30,000 feet above the United States was being communicated. Of course, unfortunately, there was nothing the people on the ground could do about any of this except watch in horror as these planes ended up where they ended up.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa Stark, who has given us a very clear picture many times today on what precisely happened, or at least as much as we know of what happened. Thank you. On board those planes, we do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting onto sites on the web, which is a very good, vigorous way for people, very good way for people to communicate. Some of the things people have been telling us at ABC News, at abcnews.com, after today, nothing changes. Sorry, everything changes. Nothing will ever be the same. The way you've lived your life, enjoyed your freedom, your very personal expression, it all changes after today. From someone else, only a month ago, I laid on a bench outside the World Trade Center and marveled at what man could create, looking up at those 110 stories, and now I stare in disbelief at what man can take away. I want retribution, said one person to abcnews.com, and that's a sentiment that has been widely, deeply expressed in the heart of the political establishment in Washington and by people in every walk of life across the country. And as George Stephanopoulos and Leon Panetta, the former White House Chief of Staff, have made very clear, and the President clearly knows already, one of the things the President has to do is be patient and understand who it is who did this before the country can do anything by way of retaliation. Is a slightly chilling one. If they can pull off an act like this, they are certainly capable of eventually sending nuclear weapons this way. And this is very interesting. How can people keep calling it the modern Pearl Harbor? At least we knew who we were up against back then. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a surprise to a great many Americans in the middle of afternoon ball games. This is the first time today that Major League Baseball has ever canceled all its games since D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in World War II. And one of the enormously frustrating things for the intelligence establishment, for the political establishment, for all of us in the country today, not to mention anyone else in the world who was a friend of the United States, perhaps even a foe, is to understand who it was who actually did this. And the reverberations from this are indeed global. Air traffic, we already know, listening to Lisa Stark and our own reporting earlier today, is snarled around the world, especially in Europe, the impact of what happens there in terms of transportation.
And they regretted it. And now college football conference commissioners will hold a teleconference at 1 o'clock Eastern time on Wednesday to determine the status of the rest of the games this week and perhaps next week as well.
And we understand, once again, these are ancillary subjects compared to the scope and magnitude of the tragedy, but they are real-life practicalities that college administrators have to deal with. And one of those things right now is the fact that recruiting for college basketball started on Sunday, and now you have coaches all over the country that have no way of getting back to their institutions of higher learning.
Yeah, Sunday was the day that college basketball coaches could go out and have home visits, visit with those players at their high schools and at their junior colleges. And a lot of coaches were stranded across the country. Some flights they couldn't get on, some they couldn't get home. Communication was tough. I talked earlier this evening with Mike Bray, the head coach at Notre Dame, and Muffet McGraw was in the car with Mike Bray, the women's coach at Notre Dame from the defending national champions. They were both, coincidentally, in Providence on their way to making home visits. Muffet McGraw in the area, Bray into Canada. They couldn't do that. They had to rent a car and drive to South Bend because they didn't know when they'd be able to get on an airplane again to get home.
Speaking of airplanes, it's important that we point out it is still much safer to fly than it is to put yourself in a car, but in light of what happened on Tuesday, coupling that with the fact of what happened to the Oklahoma State basketball team this winter, you have a lot of kids when they get to college, this is their first time experiencing flight. Is there going to be a real problem for colleges now to deal with fear of flying from these kids that come from small schools and don't know what to think now when they get on an airplane?
That's true, Trey. There's going to be a lot of issues that college coaches are going to have to deal with over the next couple of days, not just in college football, but in college basketball, volleyball, soccer, all the other non-revenue sports, especially those that have to travel great distances. They're going to have to deal with all those kinds of issues. Mike Bray did tell me that he didn't want any of his coaches to go out on the road on Wednesday. He wanted them to stay home, deal with the players that are on campus. There was already a mass at Notre Dame on their lawn, and he knows that there's going to be a lot of soul searching going on Wednesday. Security is also going to be an issue that I'm sure that a lot of these players are going to have to deal with, hoping that they are safe in their arenas, on their football fields. And that's one of the issues that a lot of these schools are going to have to address when they pour in 40 to 60 to 70 to 80,000 fans into a stadium.
And real quickly, the next conference call as far as college football will be on Wednesday?
Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. They will discuss whether or not they will have college football on Friday night, the other games that are scheduled to be played Saturday, and possibly next week.
All right, Indy, thanks very much. Bob, we'll send it back to you.
Okay, Trey. A tragedy so overwhelming is often defined in small moments and vignettes. Among the offices located in the World Trade Center was the Boomer Esiason Foundation. It was on the 101st floor of the South Tower. All 5 of the foundation's 5 employees were not in the World Trade Center this morning at the time of the attack. Boomer Esiason was in Denver on Monday evening providing radio analysis of the Monday night game.
And Bob, Tuesday's attack may have served as an intense and very real wake-up call for the upcoming Winter Olympic Games in 2002. The president of the
To the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being
evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
Authorities now say tonight 285 people, it seems, died aboard the airliners. And tonight, all flights remain grounded all across the country. Now, the FAA officials say they may reopen the national airspace tomorrow afternoon, but then again, they may not. In any case, when the flights do resume, we're told we'll see an unprecedented level of security for U.S. aviation. But even then, it will not be an aviation system that's very well equipped to prevent suicide attacks. Dan?
Bob Orr live in Washington. 285 now, the number of people aboard the hijacked planes and presumed dead. Dateline Tokyo, stocks in Tokyo plunged early Wednesday morning. Traders dumped shares, at least partially, if not mostly, in reaction to the terrorist attacks. And Dateline New York City at this hour, a story that will make your spine tingle and the hair raise up on the back of your neck. Authorities say a Munhall, Pennsylvania woman called 911 shortly before 8 p.m. tonight, New York time, saying her brother was, quote, still trapped under 40 feet of rubble near the Forward Hotel in Manhattan. That's in the area where the World Trade Center's buildings collapsed. The 911 coordinator says the victim told his sister he was still trapped under the World Trade Center wreckage. He gave specific directions to where he was located and said he was there with 2 New York City police sergeants and was calling for help. They declined to release the name of the woman, and authorities in New York said they are aware of this report of survivors. Can they get to them in the rubble where they are buried? And if so, can they get to them soon enough? A reminder, you are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Now, we'll be back after a little bit. We'll give you that break for our stations up and down the line, and we'll give another break shortly on. During this minute, let us say to you that we know that there are 285 people aboard the hijacked planes. The belief is they are dead. The numbers of dead in the World Trade Center disaster area, unknown, and it may be unknown for days, although Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has said from mid-morning that we should be prepared for very large casualties. A union firefighters official said that perhaps as many of 200 firefighters may be dead because many of them rushed to the scene immediately when the first plane cracked into the first World Trade Center building. And, well, his speculation was that as many as 200 may be dead. Unquestionably, some New York police and firefighters have lost their lives. We know not how many. At last report, dozens of New York City police officers were missing. Now, again, a reminder for our stations, you're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. CBS's special coverage of the attack on America continues, as it will throughout the evening and early morning and into tomorrow. The headlines at this hour. Addressing the nation from the White House tonight, President Bush said thousands of lives were suddenly ended, unquote, in the multiple terror attacks in New York City, the nation's capital, and Pennsylvania, and Pentagon included on that list. President Bush said bluntly, the United States will not distinguish between the terrorists who actually committed the acts and what he called those who harbor them. He did not indicate that he knows or anybody knows who committed the attacks or, for that matter, who harbored them. Here in New York City, the desperate search for victims runs on into the night. At the site where 2 hijacked commercial U.S. jetliners were used to ram the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Both towers, where approximately 50,000 people work on the average day, collapsed. A third building in the tower complex, a 47-story building, collapsed there later in the day. President Bush says the death toll is in the thousands. A third hijacked jetliner crashed into the Pentagon, and a 4th hijacked jetliner possibly being diverted to the Washington area came down in southwestern Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. All told, 285 is the revised upward number of dead on the hijacked planes alone. The FAA has ordered an unprecedented shutdown of air traffic nationwide at least through noon tomorrow. The U.S. military is on worldwide alert. The nation's capital was stunned by the attacks. Government offices were closed and evacuated, but there is every effort being made to show now that the government is still up and running, as Bob Schieffer reports to us now. Bob?
Well, Dan, like the other public buildings here in Washington, the Capitol was shut down today, the workers were sent home, and the congressional leaders, in a security measure that has never been used before, were helicoptered away to a secure location. But tonight, in an incredible show of bipartisan resolve, hundreds of members of Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol to say these acts of terrorism will not stand, the government will continue to operate, and Congress will continue to function, and that the two parties will come together to support the president.
When American suffers, and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together.
We will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice.
It was a kind of thing seldom seen here, and in a touching close, they literally sang the praises of their country.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
A very different scene than we saw at the Congress and at the Capitol last week. Tonight, Dan, all those arguments about who lost the surplus didn't seem very important anymore. This is a Congress now that is going to settle down to business. I think tomorrow you'll see them back in session, passing a very strong resolution of support of the president, determined to find who caused this and to see that there is appropriate punishment. Dan.
Bob Schieffer reporting live from Washington with the White House in the background. Here tonight with his analysis and to help give us some context and perspective is the former U.S. ambassador.
The grit in your eyes makes it almost impossible to see. The soot is absolutely everywhere still. And we talked to you before, Peter, about the fact that all of these documents, I cannot tell you what it is like to see this sea of financial documents every place. And I just picked up randomly a couple of them, and they're analysis of someone's budget, and then there's an analysis of an insurance filing, and you just keep thinking how important all of these seemed to someone 24 hours ago.
Well, Diane, thank you very much indeed for your work today. It goes without saying we value enormously. As you were talking, I was also trying to catch up to the ripple effect of this thing. We know that aircraft are grounded. Lisa Stark told us a short while ago that aviation authorities and various other governmental authorities are discussing whether or not this freeze on air travel in the country is going to last as long as the original 12-hour delay they put in it, because, among other things, Postal Service officials are now saying that mail is only going to be delivered within 600 miles of its point of origin for at least the next 24 hours, because mail going beyond 600 miles goes by a commercial carrier, and that's surely one of the things the government is talking about at the moment in terms of the interruption of national and one could argue international life at the moment. ABC's Betsy Stark, who covers the stock market, national business affairs, and international business affairs, is with us at the moment. Betsy, put together for us, if you will, the picture of a world, or much of the world, that has been brought to a halt in many ways by these incidents today.
Well, Peter, we're certainly reminded that we have a global economy and global markets. European and Latin American markets had a chance to respond to events today. As you know, U.S. financial markets were closed all day, but markets in Europe and Latin America were down sharply. Trading was halted in some of them. Asia is now having its first opportunity to react to these events, and in Japan, the Nikkei is down around 6.5%. It's been open for about an hour and a half now. Incidentally, that's the lowest level in 15 years. you know, the U.S. has been the world's real economic engine. And the U.S. is, as you know, the economy has been faltering, but this additional blow to those very visible symbols of the United States as the center of world finance has shaken investor confidence, and we're seeing that play out in global stock markets.
Now, all financial markets are going to be closed again tomorrow. The New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange will be closed.
But they will be things that have to be dealt with in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you, Peter. David Faber of CNBC and Ron Insana, our colleague, as well, and that was very well put at the end. The economy at some point will come back. Money can be replaced. The human loss today, however, and we still do not know the full proportions of that human loss. That's a tragedy that will be with us for some time. The New York City Firefighters Union still saying that at least 200 members of that union, 200 of New York's finest who were down there on emergency and rescue details right after the initial planes went into the World Trade Center, they are missing and presumed to be dead tonight. We do not know how many people are still trapped in the rubble of those two 110-story buildings that came down, nor do we know the exact death toll, for that matter, in the Pentagon, where the fires continue to burn. I just want to repeat, in New York City, for those of you who are listening to us here or in New Jersey, please contact 518-431-7600 if you can offer assistance. This is the Healthcare Association of New York State, a trade group which has volunteered to forward this information to emergency officials. The number rings and rings, but it will go through. The information that they collect is given to the city's Department of Health. That 1-800 number at 628-0193, you'll probably get a busy signal, so the number to call is 518-431-7600 if you can be of some assistance, either as a physician or as a trained medical technician or trained in the area of medical assistance of some kind. Let's go to Tel Aviv now to Donna Friesen. That is an area, of course, that has gotten a lot of attention today. Palestinian youngsters were in the streets on the West Bank celebrating this attack on America, while Yasser Arafat was condemning it. Tell us, it's now late there, obviously, what the evening was like in the Middle East, Donna.
Well, Tom, people here in Israel and in the Palestinian territories were glued to their television sets through the course of this day, stunned by events, TV stations with wall-to-wall coverage. This is, sadly, a place that is accustomed to almost daily terror attacks, but nothing, of course, on the scale, the magnitude of what we saw today in the United States. Leaders from throughout the region, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi have condemned the attacks. Among the first to voice his horror was Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. However, as you said, there is a great deal of anti-American sentiment in this part of the world, and some of that was expressed here within hours of the attack.
They are helping the Jews to kill the Palestinian people. How do you comment on the bombings in the United States?
We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Somewhere else.
Osama bin Laden's homeland. Bin Laden, now prime suspect in the attacks, has called on his followers to fight until all Americans are driven out of Islamic countries. There's long been fear the conflict in Israel could drag neighboring Arab countries into a wider war. Now this attack may further embolden enemies of Israel.
The ambitions of terrorist groups that fight against Israel will rise.
The leader of Hamas, the Islamic extremist group responsible for many suicide bombings inside Israel, says he doesn't support attacks against innocent people, but says the U.S. must reassess its position. It's the cause of injustice in many parts of the world, he says. Tonight, Israel's prime minister calling for an international war on terrorism.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
At the American embassy in Tel Aviv, flowers of sympathy.
I think very few Americans now don't understand how Israelis feel.
And Israeli airspace closed tonight, as are the borders with Lebanon, with Egypt, and with Jordan. All the checkpoints in and out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are closed, as well as a precaution in case a terrorist tries to take advantage of this situation. Several U.S. embassies in the Middle East have been closed indefinitely in Yemen, in Kuwait, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Israel has also declared tomorrow a day of mourning in solidarity with the United States. And just one more note, Tom, Israel has sent rescue teams, experts in extricating people from rubble of buildings, to New York to assist in the search and recovery efforts. Tom?
Thank you very much. Donna Friesen, who is in Tel Aviv.
To show mercy. Her brothers and sisters were suddenly and violently taken from us.
Which explains one other popular place today, St. Patrick's Cathedral.
So many people went to the centers to donate blood that in some places the wait was 7 hours long. And for that reason, the New York Blood Center is now asking only people with type O blood, either positive or negative, to go tomorrow. The rest of us should wait. And if you're interested in donating blood nationally, there is a toll-free number to call to get information. That number is 1-888-US-BLOOD. Dan.
Aaron, one thing that comes through in that report, and it's worth noting, New Yorkers, around this country, and for that matter around the world, have this reputation of being sort of chaotic all the time. But you and I know, as longtime residents of this city, that when the heat's on, when the pressure's on, New Yorkers are frequently at their best. And that was the case today, I think. That New Yorkers are, it's true, they're hard to herd, but they're impossible to stampede. And they didn't today. When the call went out for that blood, calmly people went to the blood centers. Aaron Moriarty, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Government and an industry official said at least one flight attendant and 2 passengers called from 3 of the planes as they were being forced down in New York and Washington today, each describing similar circumstances, and a picture is beginning to form. Bloodbath aboard some of those planes, with hijackers with knives attacking flight attendants. The callers indicated the hijackers armed with knives in some cases were stabbing flight attendants. And a businessman, his wife, and young child aboard a United flight that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. Twice, this businessman called his father in Connecticut as his plane was being hijacked. This is according to law enforcement officials. Now, the law enforcement official said the victim aboard the plane's father told the FBI his son made 2 calls. Both times the phone was cut off. In the first call, the businessman said a stewardess had been stabbed. In the second call, the son said his plane was going down. Now, there was another report on another aircraft that a flight attendant aboard the second jetliner that struck the World Trade Center managed to call an emergency number from the back of the plane, and an American Airlines source said that the flight attendant reported her fellow flight attendants had been stabbed. This is information we didn't have earlier, and pictures begin to form of what the terror was in the skies. 2 of the flights involved in today's attacks began in Boston. Wyatt Andrews has more on how that city has been struck by this tragedy. Wyatt?
No, but I think we lose. Kenny Hot Roll, yeah, I wouldn't do that tonight.
At Boston's Logan Airport, where 2 of the hijacked planes originated, scores of relatives of the victims were met by airline officials for consolation and were then taken to a nearby hotel to await information. American Airlines lost its Los Angeles-bound Flight 11, and the airline confirmed the identity of its lost pilot, Captain John Oganowski, who was 52 and a 22-year veteran of the airline. Outside his home in Dracut, Massachusetts, the captain's extended family gathered, including his wife and 3 daughters. Oganowski's brother Jim described him as a hero, a man who joined the Air Force out of patriotism during the Vietnam War and who viewed his work as an airline pilot his life's dream.
Our family is obviously grieving, as is the whole nation, for what has happened today. I personally, I think I'm in shock. I'm in some type of denial.
Official information about how the flights were seized and how Logan's security might have been breached is still under investigation and is closely held.
Airport officials stress that security inside Logan's terminals, as elsewhere across America, is the responsibility of the separate airlines, and that the airport itself was secure.
We've closed the airport to all arriving and all departing flights. We've increased our security measures. We've shut down all the construction sites within Logan Airport, both airside and landside.
At the Ogonowski home, official information is also apparently scarce. The pilot's brother, Jim, told reporters that the family had no information about what Captain Ogonowski went through or whether there were any communications between the pilot and FAA controllers. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Dracut, Massachusetts.
President Bush was in Florida when the attacks occurred. Florida has as its governor the president's brother, and Jeb Bush, the governor, is up for re-election. However, the president's trip to Florida today had to do with some school visitations and emphasizing his plans for education. But he quickly broke off that as soon as he learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center and said he was flying back to Washington. It didn't turn out that way, at least not directly and immediately. John Roberts has more on the President's Day and his response tonight. John?
Dan, we'll take you through more of the President's Day in just a moment, but for the moment, the President denounced tonight in the strongest terms what he called evil, despicable acts of terror, and he promised that those responsible would be identified and brought to justice.
Feared the president's home could be next.
And then everybody back, everybody back.
Fire trucks took up positions on Pennsylvania Avenue, while SWAT teams stood vigil from the roof. Police sealed off a 2-block area around the White House. The only ones left inside the mansion, the vice president and his national security team, coordinating a response to the crisis from the Situation Room. With the continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service would not allow the president to return and had him fly immediately to the security of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
Shaken and solemn, Mr. Bush addressed the nation and vowed these acts of terrorism will not stand.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
From Barksdale, the president headed for Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the Strategic Air Command, where he conferred with his national security staff about how to proceed. Confident that the White House had been secured, he then headed back for Washington, determined to send a signal to the world that America would stand strong in the face of these horrible acts.
The main message of tonight's address by the president: America will recover. The government will be open for business tomorrow. America's economy.
Second one for tower number 2, and right into it. The nose coming out the other side. Minutes later, a similar situation at the Pentagon. Similar situation happening at the Pentagon, and one plane that, as it turned out, did not end up crashing into its destination, but instead crashed in Pittsburgh, or outside Pittsburgh, as Britt Human described it earlier, working its way toward, it looked like, the Washington, D.C. area. I'm getting word from the booth now that there is an Associated Press urgent that has just come out on victims. I don't see that urgent. Is it in Associated Press urgent, or is it a AP? Attacks airline victims has just crossed. We're learning a bit more now about who may have died. American Airlines Flight 11, which was the Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles before it veered into the World Trade Center. The crew now has been listed, worth mentioning at least some of them. John Ogunsawi, who's 52, from Dracut, Mass., the pilot. Tom McGinnis, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the co-captain. Sarah Lowe from Batesville, Arkansas, a flight attendant, plus a short list of passengers as well. David Angle, 54, of Pasadena. Lynn Angle of Pasadena. Edmund Glazier of Chatsworth, California. Daniel C. Lewin, who's listed here as co-founder of the Cambridge, Mass.-based Acme Technologies. Tara Kramer, 30 years old, of Worcester, Mass., works at TJX. Ted Hennessy of Belmont, Massachusetts. The list from United Airlines, Flight 175. Victor Saraceni, lower makeup from Township, Pennsylvania, the pilot. Al Marchand of New Mexico. People from across America who were inside these planes, all losing their lives in the skies. And we've talked repeatedly about Barbara Olson, who was on a flight out of Dulles that would have taken her transcontinental. Barbara Olson calling her husband Ted, not once but twice, describing what looked like knives in the hands of those who were on board her plane before it crashed into the United States Pentagon and sent the United States into the worst act of terror ever known on planet Earth. That's the explosion now into what was the World Trade Center, the two towers of 110 stories which no longer exist in Lower Manhattan. The former police commissioner with us. I wonder now what this is going to do to all of our heads.
Well, I think it has to have what I believe is the effect of making this country resolve that we're going to deal with terrorism once and for all. And the way you deal with terrorism once and for all is you get rid of the source. And I think this is a case where we have to identify who did this, we have to find them, and we have to either bring them to justice or eliminate them.
We haven't shown a great ability to be able to get at these people of late. We really haven't. Well, I mean, CNN can interview the guy.
This is
but our military, we can't find him. Our intelligence can't find him.
This is an intelligence failure, but I don't blame it on the intelligence community. I blame it right back to Senator Church when he decimated the CIA at those hearings.
I thought we were waiting there for our Fox News stations to join us up and down the line. Now 5 minutes before 10 o'clock in the east, 5 minutes before 7 in the west. I'm Shepard Smith in New York, and this is Fox News' continuing coverage of attack on America, terrorism on American soil, thousands believed to be dead in Lower Manhattan, thousands upon thousands now trapped beneath the rubble of what was the World Trade Center, the 210-story towers reduced to rubble, a 42-story building called Building Number 7, which is right there in the World Financial Center, also reduced to rubble as two jets plowed into the side of them. Similar situation at the Pentagon in Washington. Our Washington managing editor, Britt Hume, is with us from there. Britt.
Shows that somewhere near Cleveland, the plane makes a sudden U-turn, then disappears. It crashed in this field near Pittsburgh. Its final destination unknown, but experts suspect that it was likely headed to a target in Washington, D.C.
Since the airplane crashed in a rural area...
We're going to interrupt NBC News coverage. Good evening from CNBC World Headquarters in New Jersey. I'm Ted David. We want to keep you apprised of what's going on in the financial markets in the wake of this tragedy today. Our first opportunity to see how the markets are reacting, and they have not been reacting well. We will show you the Pacific Rim markets and go live there in a moment. Let's start off with the Nikkei, which for the first time at one point was lower today than the Dow. And in fact, as you can see here, while not lower than the Dow had closed last.
Also, I'd like to say to people that might consider doing this that services should be made available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that. Yeah, the point that Richie Shearer makes is people are wonderful, and I mean this in the best sense of the word. We've had thousands and thousands of people that have come to help us. When I was down at the site near the World Trade Center, I met a lot of the National Guards, people that the governor has sent, really wonderful young men and women. We have enough volunteers now. I mean, we have more volunteers, frankly, than we need at this point. And what we need to do is to focus the efforts of the professionals that are there in being able to do the recovery and try to save as many lives as we can and restore services as quickly as possible. We may be asking for more volunteers tomorrow and the next day and the day after, but right now we don't need any more volunteers.
Mr. Mayor, is there still hope that there are people who are
Yes.
still alive in rubble?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope that there are people that are still alive.
How is
And
the rescue effort hampered by the darkness? What do you do?
we moved a lot of lights in so that the area is being lit now, so that I don't think the rescue effort is going to be hampered by the darkness. The rescue effort is hampered by the fact that there's still fire there. There are still unsound structures, and it's still dangerous, although the rescue effort is now taking place. But if you're asking me, is it hampered? It's hampered because of the conditions, not because of...
You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America.